Oh, now we're looking at verbs. This is for week 3 and it's chapter 5 in our book. We're going to talk a little bit about the main characteristics of verbs, one of the most important parts of English grammar. So, the two main components when we're looking at that verb phrase is the main verb and the auxiliary verb. Main verbs are really the action of whatever's going on or the key change that occurs. They're usually in the middle of the clause, and they will actually determine what other types of elements are possible within the clause. And it also, those patterns are what we call the valency, which is like the verb type, I think you could say that. So, you say, I went into a house is one type of valency because it's just a verb, and you have to add an adverbial after, a prepositional phrase that's acting as an adverbial after it. And you can say, I gave him the message, which is a ditransitive verb, and it's got the direct and indirect object. And then auxiliary verbs are those additional components to that verb phrase that qualify the meaning of the main verb. Could, would, all of those. Another way that we classify verbs, we can look at lexical verbs, and those are verbs that only operate as main verbs. It's an open class, so they keep adding more and more of them. And some have regular and some have irregular endings, one of those joys of English. And then the second group are primary verbs, and that's be, do, and have, and that's because they can function as both auxiliary and main verbs. And then finally we have the modal verbs, and those only operate as auxiliary verbs, and they're listed there. Lexical verbs are by far the most common that are used in English, and they go into more detail about this frequency in your book. And even across the different registers, and this is for conversation, academic English, fiction, and news, you can see that they're all, the lexical verbs are much more frequent. Although in the academic writing, which is the last bar here, there are more of the be verbs. And they talk about that a little bit in the book too, about some reasons why that might be. In the book we also talked about some semantic categories of nouns, so sort of based on meaning. And they have activity, communication, mental activities, cause and effect, just occurrence, existence, and then aspect, sort of like the process that things are going through. Here's an interesting list of the most common verbs in the corpus, starting with the verb say. And this is the kind of information that I think is very interesting to look at and sort of reflect upon, to see how much of that is really going to be useful to me. And in large part that depends on who your student audience is, what your learning outcomes are, what your objectives are for your class. I think in some ways this kind of information is more important for teachers as you're sort of trying to determine where you want to put focus on in your classes or in the materials you're going to be providing to students. And this is kind of something that I think would be invisible to most of your students. These are those valency patterns that they talk about in the book, intransitive, copular, monotransitive, ditransitive, and then complex transitive. I want you to try and become familiar with these. I don't think it's necessary to memorize those, but I think it is important to understand that these categories exist and what's going on for each category. Also, a lot of verbs, and this can be confusing if you have students asking you questions, a lot of verbs have multiple valency patterns. So for example, you can have Simon spoke, and you can just stop it there. The stewards all spoke French, and that is actually, it's a slightly different meaning of the verb. And that's something that's important to be aware of, especially when you're dealing with student questions. and how you want to approach what it means to know those verbs and to understand how they're used in English. Okay, and I think that's about all we're going to talk about for now. Please let me know if you have any questions.